President Biden and Speaker McCarthy meet today amid the nation's debt battle. I'll be explaining what is the debt ceiling, what are Democrats and Republicans fighting over, and what will happen if we default in 10 days. The NAACP issues a travel advisory to African Americans, warning them not to go to Florida because, Florida is supposedly racist towards black people. And finally, the Census releases data which reveals that Americans are making a significant exodus from blue states to red states. This is the noteworthy news that you need to know for today, Monday, May 22nd, 2023. But first, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can be notified every time a duly noted news segment comes out. And also when episodes of my show, Timeless, come out, where I talk about timeless, eternal, non-political, non-newsy subjects. So first, let's talk about this debt battle. President Biden went to the G7 summit in Japan this past weekend, and he actually cut the trip short, coming home early yesterday in order to spend more time negotiating on these debt ceiling talks. So today, Monday, he's meeting with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy after a 2.5-hour-long congressional meeting yesterday went absolutely nowhere. So both sides, that is Democrats and Republicans, are acknowledging that there is an impasse and they really want to reach a conclusion before this 10-day deadline that's about to come up on June 1st. So what is going on? We're going to start Julie Noted today by doing, how they have like a MacBook for Dummies book? We're going to be doing a debt ceiling for dummies segment, except it's not for dummies because this stuff is complicated and they make it needlessly complicated. So I'm going to explain it to you in hopefully an understandable way. First, the United States is $31.4 trillion in debt, which means we owe a lot of money to a lot of people. In 1980, we were $1 trillion in debt. Then in 1993, that went up to $5 trillion. In 2009, it went up to $10 trillion. But since 2010, that number has tripled. So in 2012, it was $16 trillion. Then in 2016, it was $19 trillion. In 2020, it went up to $26 trillion. And then now here we are at $31 trillion. That's kind of amazing that over the past decade, our debt has tripled, really just sort of exponentially grown. So why do we owe people money? And to whom do we owe? Well, the U.S. government borrows money from anyone who they can borrow money from, essentially people in this country, i.e. banks, or people in other countries who are willing to lend money to us. And this is because we have a deficit, which means that we, the U.S. government, spend more than we take in. The reasons for this deficit are a bit complicated. It's sort of like when people ask why there's a rift in a family. It depends on who is giving the explanation. Some people blame Republicans. They say that Ronald Reagan kicked this off back in the 80s by initiating great tax cuts, because when a president cuts taxes, that means that there's less revenue for the government, and then the government has to go and ask for more money and treat to foreign countries. A lot of people have blamed the wars that we initiated in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s. That cost the U.S. government $6 trillion. So certainly that was a significant contribution to our debt. Others have also blamed President Bush for, alongside spending a lot of money on wars, also cutting taxes, which is, again, lessening the revenue that the United States government takes in. People have blamed the 2008 financial crisis, where the U.S. government had to bail out big banks and hand out a lot of social services in order to raise employment. And of course, most recently, certainly the COVID-19 crisis contributed to this debt situation. The stimulus checks that the government handed out, as well as other programs during 2020, cost us $5 trillion. To borrow money, the U.S. Treasury issues what's called securities or bonds that it will pay back with interest. So this basically functions like any other loan agreement. We agree to take out a loan, and then we have to pay back interest so that the person who is loaning us money makes a profit. According to the U.S. Constitution, the House of Representatives is the one that has the power to originate bills pertaining to spending. Then the House kicks it over to the Senate that votes on it, and then obviously the president signs it into law. So the U.S. House of Representatives sets what's called a debt ceiling, which is the limit on how much money the U.S. government can borrow. So a few months ago, the U.S. House agreed to set the debt ceiling at around $31.4 trillion. And so now, in May of 2023, we are just a few digits away from reaching that debt ceiling. We are almost $31.4 trillion in debt, and that is the limit that the U.S. House of Representatives set. So once we hit this ceiling, the U.S. government can't issue new securities, i.e. borrow more money, without Congress agreeing to raise the debt ceiling, i.e. allowing us to borrow more money so that we can continue doing what we're doing. Our Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, has put June 1st, which is just 10 days away, as what's called the X date. That is the date at which the U.S. government, if the U.S. government doesn't agree to raise the debt ceiling, we will start to not be able to pay debts and also provide services to the American people, such as pay Social Security checks, continue Medicare and Medicaid payments, give veteran pensions, pay federal employee salaries. So once that starts happening, then the U.S. economy just sort of enters into disaster. Right now, we are 10 days, as I said, away from this X date. And Democrats and Republicans are mired in stalemate. According to Janet Yellen, quote, the odds of reaching June 15th while being able to pay all of our bills is quite low. So she's saying we really can't push this. June 1st is the date that we have to come to an agreement on this, because any days past that, we are not going to be able to pay out our vital services. The U.S. Treasury has said that it has already taken what they call, quote, extraordinary measures to maneuver around this problem. They've said that they are paying bills at different times to people. They're kind of sloshing money around. They're halting certain contributions to pensions. So they're trying to stave this off, but a crisis may be imminent. Needless to say, this is a big issue. If we, the United States, can't pay back our debt, then investors are going to all of a sudden rapidly sell off their holdings in treasuries. This is going to create economic panic, not to mention that it's going to make it less likely that people will loan money to the U.S. government. And also, if we can't pay government salaries and benefits, then what are people going to do? They're going to start to curtail their spending, which is the lifeblood of the U.S. economy. Once people stop spending, this leads to a huge economic slowdown. That will lead to job losses. In fact, the Treasury has estimated that if they do not reach an agreement by June 1st, there will be 250,000 job cuts in the next 6 months. So given that this is such a dire situation, what is the holdup? How are we under 2 weeks away from this date and we haven't reached an agreement? A few months ago, the U.S. House of Representatives, which again, according to the Constitution, is the one that is in charge of originating these bills, the U.S. House of Representatives is controlled by Republicans, led by Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and they passed a bill which said, we will agree to raise the debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion, but we have to cut spending. Specifically, they said that they had to cut spending by $4.8 trillion in 10 years. So where are these cuts going to come from? Well, first, Republicans have said that they want to repeal energy tax credits. They also want to pull back spending from President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which those of you who watched Julie Noted know really had nothing to do with reducing inflation. A huge part of the Inflation Reduction Act was actually giving subsidies to solar companies or green new energy companies in order to push us into a more climate-friendly direction. But this distorts the economy by pushing too much money into some sectors and not letting other sectors thrive. Another thing that they want to do, i.e. the Republicans, is prevent President Biden's student debt cancellation. They want to expand work requirements for Medicaid, so that will lessen the amount of people who are on Medicaid. And also, Republicans have said we have to expand fossil fuel mining and production. Or at the very least, we have to eliminate the penalties that the Biden administration has imposed on fossil fuel companies, because that's going to create employment and it will make it less likely that we have to entreat to banks or to foreign countries to lend us money. So Republicans, leading up to the midterms, campaigned heavily on the fact that we spend way too much. So it makes sense that these were the terms of the agreement that the House of Representatives under Speaker Kevin McCarthy proposed. But what happened was, this was a few months ago when the Speaker proposed this. The White House countered by saying, no, we are not going to agree to cut spending over a 10-year period. We will agree to cut it by over 2 years, but not over 10 years. So then Kevin McCarthy, after hearing what the White House said, well, sorry, we're not changing our position. It's just irresponsible for us to keep borrowing money, especially as we know over the past 6 weeks, 3 of the 4 largest bank failures in U.S. history have occurred. So Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy is holding firm on his position. Also, Speaker Kevin McCarthy points out that half of the U.S. debt is financed short term. This means essentially that we have to roll it over every few months and agree to higher interest rates. So as interest rates increase, and we know that they are increasing a lot these days, it keeps the cycle of borrowing going, because to pay for the higher interest rates, we have to borrow more money, and it's just this vicious cycle. So it really was, if you look back at the past few years, it was just irresponsible of the U.S. government to not finance our debt long term when interest rates are low. Again, financing it short term means you have to agree to the current interest rates. As they're increasing, it means that we're just paying more and more and more, getting more in debt. So now we're in a situation where Democrats are blaming Republicans, Republicans are blaming Democrats, they're accusing each other of not trying to negotiate. Let's listen to what the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said about this debt crisis.
If Speaker McCarthy continues in this direction, we are headed to default.
America's role in the world is vital, especially right now.
Well, what's exacerbating this stalemate is that this X date, which is June 1st, is 10 days away. Also, just as icing on the cake, the Senate is gone this week on vacation. They're going to come back after Memorial Day. But then once they're back, the House of Representatives is gone for their vacation the week of Memorial Day, and next Thursday is June 1st. So we really have to hope that today, when President Biden and Speaker McCarthy are meeting, that they will come to some sort of conclusion. Now, President Biden has previously called Speaker McCarthy's proposal, quote, extreme and unacceptable, but he does seem to want to, at the very least, negotiate. Let's listen to what President Biden said recently.
America's role in the world is vital, especially right now, as we work together with other countries to support Ukraine and take on the challenges that demand international cooperation, and from tackling the climate crisis to strengthening the global economy. And before I leave, I wanted to say a word about the status of negotiations with the congressional leaders. We had a productive meeting yesterday, and with all 4 leaders in the Congress. It was civil and respectful, and everyone came to the meeting, I think, in good faith. I'm confident that we'll get the agreement on the budget, that America will not default.
That's positive. Speaker McCarthy has echoed this statement, though he has blamed Democrats for waiting until 10 days before this X date to start negotiations. Again, the House passed this bill a few months ago, so there's been plenty of time for both sides to enter into agreement. Finally, let's listen to what Speaker McCarthy said.
Well, the difference is our meetings before were staffers of the 4 leaders, and there was no time that we were going to get an agreement continuing that way. What we really have to do is what every time before was able to do. The president should appoint either himself or people from his administration to negotiate directly with myself, something that Mitch McConnell has said, something that President Trump did with Nancy Pelosi, with Bush and Obama did before. That is a structure that could actually find a way that we can come to fruition. The challenge here is the president waited 104 days till he came to this conclusion. Look, I went in February 1st. I said, no new taxes and no clean debt ceiling, but everything else is on the table. I want to be reasonable, I want to be sensible, but more importantly, we want to be responsible. And he ignored us, said we couldn't have a negotiations. Now is the final time that he finally admitted we're going to negotiate, and we have a structure to negotiate. The problem is the timeline is very short. But Republicans are the only one who have passed a bill to limit Save and Grow, to raise the debt ceiling, and actually make the economy stronger.
We will certainly keep you updated as to what happens with this debt negotiation, though honestly, there won't even be a need for me to keep you updated, because if we default, trust me, all of us are going to be painfully aware of it in our own daily lives. Now, moving on to another stunning story. The NAACP CEO and board of directors has issued a travel advisory warning Black Americans to not travel to the state of Florida. You cannot make this up. The NAACP board of directors issued this advisory this past weekend, actually not just for African Americans, but also for LGBTQ plus Americans, warning them to be aware of some state laws that, quote, are aggressive attempts to erase Black history and restrict DEI. This is what the NAACP CEO has said as evidence of how Black people shouldn't travel to Florida, because apparently Florida has all of these racist, terrible laws and initiatives under the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis. I'm reading from a letter that they put out. Quote, under the leadership of Governor Ron DeSantis, Florida is openly hostile towards African Americans, people of color, and LGBTQ individuals. This is in direct conflict with the democratic ideals that our union was founded upon. The NAACP is not the only group that has issued travel warnings to certain segments of the population. The League of United Latin American Citizens and Equality Florida, which is a pro-LGBTQ group, has also issued similar warnings. In an ultimate twist of irony, guess where the board's chairman, that is the NAACP's chairman, lives? His name is Leon Russell. He lives in Florida. He lives in Tampa, Florida, and he's the one that is behind this travel advisory. And by the way, he's also Black, and he's telling Black Americans that it's somehow unsafe to travel to the state in which he lives. Now, what is this aggressive attempt to erase Black history, according to the NAACP? Well, back in January, Governor DeSantis of Florida blocked a new Florida high school AP course on African American history because Governor DeSantis said that it was promoting a crazy political agenda instead of teaching useful and important information about Black history in the United States. Here were some of the things that this AP African American history course included. Quote, the case for reparations. By the way, this isn't Governor DeSantis describing the AP African American history course. I am reading right now directly from the College Board's proposal of what this course would teach. The case for reparations, also the missions, origins, and global influence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black queer studies, which explores, quote, Black feminism and intersectionality, and that shifts sexuality studies towards racial analysis. It would also have taught, quote, post-racial racism and colorblindness, and finally, intersectionality and activism. Now, if you are listening to me and you're a bit confused about what all of this means, what is Black queer studies, what is intersectionality, what is post-racial racism, etc., if it doesn't make sense, it's probably crap. And the thing is, our test scores in the United States have witnessed a stunning decline. I reported about this on Julie Noted just last week. According to the nation's report card, that is the federal group which puts out test scores every few years. They recently released a report. According to the nation's report card, only 13% of 8th graders in American public schools met proficiency standards for U.S. history. Less than 20% scored at proficiency levels for civics. And it's not just history and civics that have seen remarkable declines. Back in October, the nation's report card released a report that there was the largest drop in math scores ever in American history from 2019 to 2022. There was also a 30-year record drop in reading. In 2022, average math scores for 8th graders dropped 8 points from 2019, and reading fell 3 points, okay? So it's interesting that the NAACP is taking issue with Governor DeSantis' opposition of this AP African American history course. Governor DeSantis wasn't opposing the course in its entirety, as evidenced by the fact that he actually approved the passage of the course once these political teachings were eliminated. So there was this back and forth between DeSantis and the College Board, and finally the College Board conceded to getting rid of some of those politicized elements and substituting them with, oh, I don't know, actual history. So Governor DeSantis wanted to reform this AP African American course. He didn't want to not teach it at all. Also, Florida requires public schools to teach, quote, the enslavement experience, the civil rights movement, and the contributions of Black Americans. In fact, this supposedly racist governor, Ron DeSantis, back in 2020, signed a bill that he originated into law in Florida, mandating that Florida public schools teach about a 1920 massacre in which a white mob killed tens of Black Floridians. So Governor DeSantis wants Black history to be taught. He just doesn't want this politicized version of it. And given the amount that test scores have plummeted, wouldn't a group like the NAACP support a move like this? Wouldn't they want to see test scores go up, which is the #1 indicator of economic mobility in order to succeed in life, in order to have good employment prospects? You need to have good test scores. You need to get a good education. Wouldn't the NAACP like that Governor DeSantis is trying to improve the education experience? No, they don't. They are just trying to come up with a grievance in order to sow the seeds of political divides. And one may believe that I am being a bit cynical, but I don't think it is a coincidence that the NAACP is coming out and saying that Florida is supposedly this horrible place for Black people to go to ahead of the 2024 imminent presidential election that we are about to have. It is a classic playbook of the left and the Democratic Party to try to convince Black Americans that racism is rampant and that specifically red states, conservatives, Republicans are behind it. It is a tactic that they get so that Black Americans will vote Democrat, and frankly, it is sick. And to think about the way that the NAACP has evolved, I learned about the NAACP in elementary school. They were this wonderful group that was on the vanguard, was the leader, indeed, of the civil rights movement. They were founded in 1908 after a deadly race riot. They were the ones that were trying to oppose, not impose, the terrible lynchings that were going on in the South. They were one of the biggest forces in overturning Jim Crow in the 1960s. They worked with titans of the civil rights movement, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall. What a rich legacy this organization has. And to see that now this is how they are focusing their attention, it is sick. Finally, because the NAACP also said that Florida is this terrible place for LGBTQ citizens, the reason why they are saying this is because of the supposed Don't Say Gay bill that Governor DeSantis passed into law a few months ago. The Democrats called it a Don't Say Gay bill, even though nowhere in the bill did they prevent teachers or students from using the word gay. The bill merely mandated that no sex and gender talk pertaining to homosexuality, transsexuality, and even heterosexuality be taught for students under the 3rd grade. It was not a bill that was targeted specifically at the LGBTQ populace. It was equally as targeted against the heterosexual populace. It was just trying to get sex out of public school teaching for people under a certain age. And finally, one of the things that the NAACP points to as supposed discrimination against the LGBTQ is that the Florida State Senate recently passed a bill to ban gender transition surgeries for minors. Now, this bill has yet to be approved by the Florida House of Representatives and signed into law by Governor DeSantis. But if the NAACP thinks that Florida is a terrible place for wanting to prevent the genital mutilation of minors, then we just have hopelessly irreconcilable different views of what should be deemed to be allowed here in this country. Now, on to some good news. Believe it or not, there is some good news amid this debt crisis, amid this terrible NAACP scandal. There is a huge exodus, according to new numbers released by the U.S. Census, where people are moving from liberal cities and liberal states to conservative cities and conservative states. Actually, this is a very nice segue from the NAACP story. because many think that a large reason why the NAACP is trying to create this narrative about Florida is because so many blue states are witnessing such an exodus, and the #1 most moved to state in the entire country is Florida. New York City lost over 468,000 people. That's 5.3% of its population in 2022. That is the entire population of Miami that just left New York City in 2022. Many citizens cite the high cost of living and also the rampant crime that has come, unfortunately, to plague and infect the city. The city of Chicago, also infected by crime and high living costs, lost 81,000 people in 2022. Los Angeles lost 76,000, and San Francisco, where Whole Foods recently moved their headquarters out of because of the rampant crime, San Francisco lost 65,000 people, which is the largest share of its population, that's about 7.5% of its population, than any other city that moved out of that one location. Meanwhile, since the start of 2023, 10,000 New Yorkers alone, just New Yorkers, have moved to Florida. 64,000 of that 465,000 that moved out of New York City, 64,000 of that group moved to Florida. So that's about 10% in 2022 of New Yorkers that moved to Florida. Again, Florida is the #1 state for incomers. And although it's sad to see these once great cities becoming so decrepit, it should be encouraging to all of us that a way that people can vote is through their place of residence. The Citadel CEO, Ken Griffin, moved his hedge fund from Chicago to Miami, citing, again, costs and crime. Whole Foods, as I said, shut down their headquarters in San Francisco. Even the CEO of McDonald's has said that they needed to close many of its locations in liberal cities because the crime is just so untenable, and it is creating a huge problem as far as their businesses because people don't want to go to McDonald's out of fear that they may be attacked. Finally, Target has come out and said that it lost over $500 million in profits in 2022 because of the crime issue. Again, though this is a really sad situation, at least a lot of people are voting with their residential status, and hopefully, it will enact some much needed change. Thanks everyone for joining me today. Again, reminder to subscribe to this channel. Also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. And I'll see you with more news soon.